Catherine the Great, Chapter 8. Paul noticed that the entries in his mother's diary were getting shorter and more functional. She was recording fewer of her thoughts, fewer of her impressions of people, and again, there was a long gap in the record. For almost a year between September 1772 and August 1773, the entries were scraps of sentences, odd words, and reminders that Catherine had written to herself, but which meant nothing to Paul. Sometimes he came across phrases about the war in Turkey, but these were cryptic, difficult to interpret. Light Horse, Infantry Division East. Often there was the title and the author's name of the book she had read, although even these were becoming fewer. Paul realized that the name of Dennis Diderot cropped up in some regularity. He recalled the French philosopher's visit to the Winter Palace. Paul had been 19 then, and had taken up with his love for Wilhelmina, and he had taken much notice of the man. Even though his mother had several times invited him to join the conversations that she and Diderot had each afternoon, while he was in St. Petersburg. As Paul leafed through the almost empty book, he suddenly came to a page with the letters C plus D written on top and nothing else on the page at all. Paul remembered the parcel that was marked with the same way and pulled it out from where he had to push it to the end of the seat. The string slipped off easily, and open parcel revealed a thick pile of notepaper sheets covered in even, neat writing that gave them the look of legal document. There was a smaller sheet there, too, a note written in the same hand. Winter Palace, April 1774. Madam, this package contains the transcripts of the conversations you had with Monsieur Diderot between September 12th and 1773 and March 30th and 1774. May it please you, Your Highness, and to accept them with my wishes for your continuing health and long reign. When Paul looked more closely at the stack of papers, he realized that there were over 100 pages, all neatly dated and noted. They were the work of professional secretary or scribe. He carefully took the first and read it, conscious of the fact that he was handling an important historical artifact. The Winter Palace, September 12th, in the year of our Lord 1773. Catherine II, Empress of Russia. What do you think of my capital city, Monsieur Diderot? Monsieur Diderot, I take it you mean St. Petersburg. I have not yet seen Moscow. Most people in Europe, you know, think that Moscow is the capital. Catherine II, Empress of Russia. St. Petersburg is still being built and will be for many years to come, but it is over 50 years old now. Surely Europe and French and the Germans should know enough of Russia to understand that it is our capital. Monsieur Diderot, Russia is still a land of mystery to most Europeans. It's such a difficult place to reach, even though you sent a very comfortable carriage for me to ride in and the best horses to pull it. It still took me 5 weeks to get here. The only thing that most people know about it is the year writers are the worst in the world, except at the North Pole, and that you are at war with Turkey. Catherine II, Empress of Russia. It's true that the war against Turkey continues to drag on. I tell you frankly, monsieur, even I am beginning to wonder if the war is worth the money we spend on it. But it keeps my army occupied and trains and soldiers for further action. And the Turks must respect our borders. They must. Monsieur Diderot, it is that kind of attitude that encourages those in Europe to think that you are barbarians. Why don't you consider a negotiation first and keep the war as a last option? Catherine II, Empress of Russia. The Europeans should be the last ones to lecture me on going to a war without cause. They all do it all the time. Monsieur de Droit, but Europeans have moved forward. They consider Russia backward, and it's an instance on holding on to the feudal system and the serfs. How is it that an empress such as you, obviously well educated and forward thinking, can cling to the idea of slavery as a form of government? Catherine II, Empress of Russia. I can assure you, monsieur, that my people are not slaves. You Europeans have no idea what it's like to run such a large country as Russia. Land is to be worked, and the workforce organized effectively, or everyone will starve. Monsieur de Droit. But these people you claim are not slaves have no rights as citizens at all. Catherine II, Empress of Russia. Of course they do. Monsieur de Droit. Madam, with respect, they do not. Since you annexed the eastern Polish territory and found you had to move some Russian peasants there to keep order, you have passed laws that have made it impossible for serfs to leave their employment or to seek new masters, or even to leave their homes without their lord's permission. Catherine II, Empress of Russia. Only troublemakers have any wish to leave their employment. No one, Monsieur de Droit, no one in the world loves his home and land as much as a Russian peasant. Serfs are not slaves. They are independent thinkers. Monsieur de Droit. Monsieur de Droit did not answer. He merely looked skeptical. Catherine II, Empress of Russia. For all your wisdom and new ideas, monsieur, I must tell you that the practice of governing a country is very different from your bookish theories, even though I very much enjoy reading them. Monsieur de Droit. If the world is to change for the better, madam, we must begin somewhere. The place must be with new ideas on paper and in books. Catherine II, Empress of Russia. The empty page is always flexible. The writer can make it do anything. But I must work with the physical human lives. There are people to be fed, a new generation of Russians to nurture. These things I cannot allow to pause while I experiment. Paul set the pages aside. He remembered well how, in the spring of 1774, only a month after Diderot had departed from St. Petersburg on his long journey back to France, Catherine's theories of government had been put to test. He knew that what sort of material the next letter would contain when he saw Panya's writing on the fold. Moscow, October 1st, 1773. Madam, several agents in the south are reporting that an unusual uprising among disaffected peasants is occurring. Apparently, it is centered on a single man, a Kazakh Yemelyan Ivanovich Pugachev. He is or has been married to Sofia Nedyuzhova, a Kazakh woman. He is 33 or 34 years old, an army veteran of the Persian War, was a podporuchik, has since been twice arrested as a deserter, but has always claimed he was properly discharged in 1765. He has spent some time with the monks at the old believers' monasteries. It is from them that he has gained his knowledge about the imperial scars, that he claims gives him the status of an emperor. In fact, he claims that to be the resurrected noble personage of your deceased husband, the Emperor Peter III. I estimate that Pugachev's followers number perhaps 100 or so. Like all these kinds of treasons, it will fade out when we make a few arrests. It is my opinion that your Highness need not concern herself with the matter. I will direct the local security forces, and it will be quickly dealt with. Panyan. Moscow, November 30th, 1773. Madam, agents from Voronezh and Zhanyabek, and from as far south of Taganrog, are reporting that the criminal Pugachev is rallying significant amounts of support. He is, they say, an effective public speaker. He appeals to the lower classes by telling them that they are overtaxed. It is impossible to say to what extent his support has grown, but large crowds are attending the rallies that he holds in the marketplaces of the towns. We have arrested 8 of his followers who have also been holding public meetings and causing public nuisance. But Pugachev himself has managed to stay within the law as far. Moscow, December 19th, 1773. Madam, 2 developments. Our Janibek agent informs me that Pugachev has openly advocated the overthrow of your Highness's Russian throne. The second matter is more alarming. It has come to light that Pugachev's network is a great deal more extensive than we had imagined. His follower numbers are at least several thousand, under the pretense that he is Peter III. Pugachev has built his own army and public service. Both of these are modeled on that of Your Highness's army and bureaucracy. Some of the ringleaders of this criminal gang have been given themselves titles such as Duke and Count. Also, it is reported that Pugachev has an army training establishment somewhere in the South Ural Mountains. He has an efficient network of spies and a postal and a communication network. With the help of local religious leaders from both Christian and Muslim communities, he has issued a royal decree, a copy of which is included for Your Highness's information. Like all criminal revolutionaries, Pugachev has promised his followers land and reduced taxes. It does not seem reasonable to suppose that Pugachev is the only architect of all this. He is, at base, an illiterate Kazakh peasant, and such a person can hardly be a real danger. Others are his masters, I am sure. However, we have yet to discover who they are. In meantime, we can now say that Pugachev has definitely committed treason, and I have issued a warrant for his immediate arrest on these grounds. Panyan. Paul smiled to himself. Panyan had been caught unprepared for what had happened next. This idea that Pugachev was just an illiterate Kazakh peasant and was therefore not very dangerous was quite wrong, and showed that Panyan really mixed with or thought about the ordinary people of Russia. His judgment of them was very poor. Paul remembered the first day of spring 1774 only too well. Called from his bed early to attend an emergency meeting of Catherine's advisers, he had reluctantly walked through the cold corridors of the palace to the conference room, rubbing his still sleepy eyes. With his wife, Wilhelmina, had been heavily pregnant, and he had spent as much time as possible near her. The duty of going to any meetings irritated him, or one for which he had to rise especially early was even more annoying than usual. As Paul walked, he realized that the palace was alive with rumors. The servants whispered together. Military advisor hastily summoned from the barracks on the outskirts of St. Petersburg arrived with their briefcases full of papers, their secretaries trailing behind in the groups of 2 or 3. Paul was surprised to see Kiritsky from the treasury, and Alexei Orlov, whom Paul had thought was still in Turkey commanding his troops. They gathered in the conference room before 7. Grigory Potjopkin was there, looking especially grim with his eyes patched and wild dark curly hair. Catherine presided at the meeting and spoke first. Her first secretary, taking notes, could barely keep up with what Catherine said. The Empress was angry, angrier than Paul had ever seen her. She spoke rapidly and forcefully, almost in a growl. She had been betrayed, she said, let down by the people she had most relied on. Here she glanced at Panyan, who shrank in his chair like a child being told off by his parent. People she believed would give her correct information in good time. How had Pugachev managed to grow so strong so quickly? How had he managed to march an army of 2,000 men over 1,000 kilometers from Taganrog to Kazan? He had attacked Samara and Kangur on the way. Why had no army units been dispatched to stop him? How had he managed to set fire to the city of Kazan so easily? Why were the men in charge of the secretary of the country so failing in their duties? When Catherine stopped talking, there was hardly a man in the room who had not felt her anger and contempt. Even Paul had been accused of taking no interest in his own country, his own inheritance. Eventually, she stood mute and breathed deeply, forcing herself to control her temper. Abruptly, she turned to Panyan. "Speak," she commanded, and Panyan began in a hesitant voice. "Regrettably, it is even worse than your Highness has described. In the course of march between Taganrog and Kazan, Pugachev's army has stolen guns. We think they have at least 2 or 3 heavy cannon and hundreds of smaller arms. And it's true that they fired at the city. They are also killing the citizens, men, women, and children. Enough," said Catherine. She turned to Grigory Orlov, softening her voice barely at all. "What are your thoughts?" "We must mobilize a regiment, Your Highness." "You're very good at telling me what's obvious," she said irritably. "Gentlemen," she glared at the faces around the table, "which regiment do you suggest?" There was an uneasy silence. Paul sensed a trap for whoever answered. "The Preobrazhensky Guards," someone ventured. Catherine froze him with a look so icy that Paul was amazed that the man did not die on the spot. "The Preobrazhenskys are in the front line in Turkey, you idiot!" "The Pospolitas?" Catherine gave the speaker a withering glance. "They are a foot regiment. They have no horses. Have you any idea how long it would take them to get to Kazan?" One by one, Catherine rejected the names of regiments put forward as suggestions. None were in any position to immediately march to Kazan. Most were in Turkey. Some were stationed thousands of kilometers away in Russia's far east. Some had been disbanded and their men disappeared amongst the other regiments. What impressed Paul most at the meeting that had been his mother's knowledge of every aspect of her army. She knew the strength of the regiments, the numbers of horses, heavy guns, food wagons, the condition of the uniforms, the barrack size, how many men were on the leave at any one time. She even knew the regimental commanders by name. "You," she snapped, speaking to an older general that Paul did not know. Later he discovered that that man had been directly responsible for the long and very drawn-out negotiations that were expected to bring an end to the Russo-Turkish War. "How many wounded are at the Balta?" The general's fumbling at his sheaf of papers brought an exasperated look from Catherine. It was Alexei Orlov, who had so far remained silent, who spoke. "There are just over 1,000, madam," he said, looking directly at Catherine. "Shall I make a suggestion?" "Of course," snapped Catherine. "Get on with it." "The peace with Turkey could be concluded within a fortnight if your Highness were to forget about the extra war reparations payments you have demanded from the Turks. It is the only sticking point of negotiations. Show yourself a magnanimous ruler and forgive them. He could begin withdrawing our troops from Turkey tonight. They can make for Kazan immediately. Samara and Kungur will be in their path. If they leave the front line soldiers in the place in Turkey, the Turks will be entirely unaware of what we are doing." Catherine looked at Alexei with what Paul thought was a new respect. "Do it," she said. "Light the signal fire straight away." Then she turned to the old general with just 3 words: "See to it." And then to the rest of the assembly: "Get her right this time." And she rose from the table and swept out of the room. As she did so, Paul distinctly saw her nod some kind of signal of agreement to Potemkin, who acknowledged the sign with the smallest movement of his head. As the footman opened the door for the Empress, Paul saw a servant and a lady in waiting, who had been dozing on their feet outside the conference room, startled awake and hurrying to catch up with her as quickly moved down the corridor. Paul had good reason to remember Pugachev's trial in the early summer of 1774. His mother had sent him to Moscow as her representative and an observer. Pugachev himself had been brought to the city in a wooden cage on an open cart. From the inside of his own carriage, Paul saw the crowds pelt him with stones and rotten fruit and vegetables on his way through the streets. The man was dirty and disheveled and had been roughly treated by the guards and tormentors. He was weak and starving from the beatings he had taken and lack of food. When Paul saw was a broken man who begged for mercy at every opportunity, but was given none. In his appeals to the crowds, Pugachev had claimed to the reincarnation of Paul's father, Peter III. Paul himself had been spoken of in ways that suggested he would support Pugachev and restore the rightful bloodline to the throne. Even though all this was nonsense, it was dragged out in court and spoken of again and again by the government lawyers acting against Pugachev. Even under the most intense questioning that Panin could devise, Pugachev admitted no association with anyone else. He said he acted alone and was alone guilty, and although hundreds of his followers were sent to lifetime sentences in the mines of Siberia and the Far East, it was Pugachev alone who was executed by beheading. Catherine herself made an appearance in the courtroom when the sentence was read. Paul saw his mother smile for the first time in many months. End of chapter 8.